Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And when I started out at the Financial Times as a reporter, there were a handful, 3, maybe 5 people who you hoped one day would answer your call. And one of them was Sir Ronald Cohen. And that was because at the time he'd been the founder of Apax and more or less created an industry that I didn't really understand called private equity, an industry of investment. But over the years, as I hoped that one day Ronnie would answer my call, you stopped trying to call him to get a story and you started trying to call him for ideas, because he became a person who not only had been a sort of superstar in the world of business and investment, but then rethinking what capital and the power of money could do in making peace, in changing social outcomes. And it was a curious thing that by the time he finally did answer my call, I remember thinking, I've not come here with any questions about stories. I've come here with really fundamental questions about capitalism, about the system of the market. And tonight, if you like, the conversation continues. It continues in the context of life in the COVID-19 world. But what we're really trying to do is think through and understand the potential of impact investing. Now, you're going to be glad to know that I'm not going to try and explain impact investing, what it can do, what it should do, what it might do. I'm going to ask Ronnie Cohen to do that. But we're also joined, I hope, by people who will help give some context, give some granular examples. We're very lucky that Safeena Husain is joining us too. She generously, more generously than any of us, has joined us from the outskirts of Mumbai. So, you know, it's the middle of the night there. So, you know, if you drop off, Safeena, we won't take it personally. It's just, it's got very late. But thank you for joining us. And many of you who've been to our think-ins, particularly when we've been thinking about AI, will know Dr. Amel Karboul because she's joined us. She's the CEO of the Education Outcomes Fund. And so it's no surprise that between what Ronnie Cohen's done in terms of impact investing, what Amel has done in terms of education outcomes, and what Safeena's doing in terms of Educate Girls, the organization she founded, there's a kind of natural grouping here. If you've never been to a think-in before, though, you'll know that the real grouping that matters is everyone that's on the call this evening. What we really want to do is hold, if you like, an open news meeting where everyone weighs in and says, look, this is what we think money should be doing now, not just in terms of addressing the COVID-19 world, but some of the really intractable problems we've seen for some time. So if you want to do that, please do weigh in the chat. You'll know how it works. You just sort of type in. My colleague, fellow editor, Alexi Mostras is on the line. He's going to be trying to corral the chat. There he is. Hello, Alexi. Or if you want to just catch my eye, do just hit the participants tab. You'll see you can raise your hand. A little blue digital hand comes up and I'll bring you into the conversation. The idea that we've got tonight is to try to think through the future of impact investment. As tempting as it is to treat this as a Q&A with Ronnie, actually, what we want are your ideas, your perspectives. So I'm going to try to enforce the loosely enforced rule of a think-in, which is no questions. We want to hear your ideas, your points of view. The one exception, of course, is me. I get to ask some questions. So I'm going to start, if I might, Ronnie, by asking you, can you just explain to us what is impact investing?
Yes, James, first of all, it's wonderful to be here with you and with Safeena and Amel to talk about my favorite subject now. Impact investment is investment that has as its goal not just profit, but profit and measurable impact on people and on planet. It's doing good and doing well at the same time, if you like.
And I remember when we first talked about it, we talked, I think, about social impact bonds, and there was a particular case. Would you just talk it through the Peterborough example? Because I think it's the one that speaks to the point about measurable impact.
Yes. the Peterborough Bond was raised in 2010, and it's interesting to talk about it, James, because Safeena was the beneficiary of a social impact bond in the field of education with fantastic results. We had tried for a decade to identify a way of bringing investment to charitable organizations. It seemed strange that we'd invented ways of helping people to make money through venture capital and access investment to do so. But we'd never done the same for people like Safeena and Amel, who want to improve the lives of others. And so in 2000, the Social Investment Task Force published a report saying we ought to be able to make this connection. And in 2010, we launched the first social impact bond, which, as you say, aimed to reduce the number of young prisoners going back to Peterborough Prison within 18 months of release. 60% or more across the world of young prisoners go back to jail within 18 months, a horrific figure. And we came up with the idea that we would raise £5 million to help charitable organizations working with prisoners to reduce that rate. And that if we got the government to pay for the reduction, then investors would find the investment attractive because they could make money according to the number of prisoners who went into jobs instead of going back into jail. And that appealed to a lot of foundations and a lot of private individuals. In the event, this bond over 5 years reduced the rate of reoffending by 9.7%. And so the government paid back to the investors their £5 million with an annual return of 3.1% a year.
And forgive me, Ronnie, is that a good deal for investors? Do they think, well, 3.1% return on my investment is much to brag about?
So it may not sound like a very high return, but social impact bonds can pay up to 10 or 12%. Right. If the interventions are particularly successful. What's attractive about them, James, is they are what's known as an uncorrelated return security, meaning by that they continue to deliver their returns, whether or not the stock market goes up or down, or whether or not interest rates go up or down. And actually, across the world, people are looking for investment opportunities that don't go up and down with the stock market, as we've seen with the gyrations of recent months. So it is an attractive risk-adjusted return.
And are you frustrated by the take-up of impact investment by governments? Because the reality is that we've talked about Peterborough for some time, and you see the model. The model only works if you like, the government, if public policymakers are willing to do it at scale. And so far, it seems as though it's been piecemeal. Is that not right?
That is right. And we're going beyond that, which is what Amel will be addressing, because she is raising $1 billion education outcomes fund to take the place of government with government participation. But the thing that I think you and our listeners will find interesting is that while the social impact bond, and there are now a couple of hundred across 30 countries tackling 15 different social issues, the social impact bond looked like a clever way to bring investment to not-for-profits. But as we continued to work in the field through the G8 task force on impact investment, we began to realize that the world was going in the direction of seeking more than profit. So today, $30 trillion of money, 15% of the world's investable assets, 30% of professionally managed money goes to what's known as environmental, social, and governance investing. not just making money, but trying to prevent harm from being done to the environment, and sometimes actually trying to bring solutions. And that investment is, in a way, doing what the first social impact bond did, in the sense that this mechanism balanced risk, return, and impact. And so does ESG investing do it. And my contention in my book, which is coming out on the 2nd of July, is that the whole world is moving now to optimizing risk-return impact within our economic system. And the social impact bond was just the path to what we are going to call impact economies and impact capitalism.
Well, and so I understand that. And by the way, you know, there's a whole movement, Ronnie, for measuring how well people have orchestrated their Zoom rooms. I think you may win the prize for the perfect positioning, if I see it correctly, of the impact book right over your left shoulder. So if you haven't read it there, it sits there just between Ronnie's ear and his shoulder. That's it, the impact book that you must go on. I think it's coming out, when is it? July, early July.
Yeah, July 2nd. And
we must
it's already.
But can I just understand that what you're saying is the thing that we talked about initially, Peterborough and social impact bonds, you think is actually going to end up being just a small part of what you call impact capitalism, a much broader approach to investment that is all around these measurable impacts?
Yes, it's actually bringing impact, which we can measure in a similarly dependable way to risk and profit, impact alongside profit to decision-making within investment organizations and within businesses.
Okay. Well, I mean, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go to Safeena to talk about, if you would, Safeena, just the sort of real-world impact of educated girls. And Ronnie, in the course of the next 45 minutes or so, I'd really like us as a group to kick the tires on the idea of impact investment, and also, you know, this belief that capital can be deployed to deliver better outcomes, because I think there's quite a large and growing body of opinion that is losing patience with capitalism and the outcomes that it delivers. But Safeena, why don't you tell us sort of practically a little bit about Educate Girls and how the way the money's come to you has had an impact on the ground?
Sure. Thank you, James. So I started Educate Girls about 12 years ago, and really I grew up with a lot of poverty and violence, and I was lucky enough that I became the first person in my family to go to university overseas. I went to London School of Economics, and it totally changed my life. And so that's why I have decided to dedicate my life to actually bringing girls who are not in school back into school. I started about 12 years ago, and really because I truly believe that it is one way that we can change the world. Educating girls, you know, helps to improve 9 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Climate scientists have rated 80 actions. This is Project Drawdown to solve global warming and reduce carbon emissions, and girls' education comes at number 6 out of 80 actions. At number 6, it's coming before solar panels and electric cars. That's how powerful it is in terms of battling, you know, reducing carbon emissions, and also really building climate resilience on the ground. So this is a battle that we really have to, and it's a battle of our lifetime, because once a girl is educated and a mother is educated, she is 200% more likely to educate her own daughters. So that's what I really wanted to do. And we've been growing rapidly in the last 12 years. You know, we've grown we've doubled in size almost every 18 months. And today we're working in over, 14,000 villages. I have 1,700 full-time staff, 14,000 community workers, and we're serving about 2 million children daily on the ground. And so for this, you know, when you're scaling so much in size, money is really important. Where do you find the resources? So one was that. One was really like you have to keep all your donors, and then you have to try and find new money and lots of new money every, at each doubling. the second piece that we scaled very rapidly in a few years from 500 schools to 5,000 schools. And what really worried me was, am I just replicating or am I actually scaling results and scaling quality? And then I saw DFID put out, a girl education challenge, and we applied for it. And it had a component saying payment by results. And I was very intrigued. And I thought, if I could deliver to results and if money could be tied to results, then I could build an organization that was not just scaling and replicating, a set of activities, but was really scaling impact, because I wanted to hold myself accountable to that last, that millionth girl or that 10 millionth girl that we actually bring into school. So really that, DFID, of course, changed and said, no more India, we're not going to fund India. So, which in some ways, I guess, worked out for us, because then we worked and we put together partners, investors, and outcome funder, and really gave shape to the world's first development impact bond. And what was different here was that it was about paying for a result. And the result was we would find an out-of-school girl. And what we do in the model is that we actually work in very rural, remote, and tribal areas. And we knock on every single door in the village to find out-of-school girls. And then we convince their parents.
Sorry, Safeena, forgive me. I just wanted to interrupt you because I just wanted to understand how a development impact bond works. So the funding agency, or in this case, let's say the funding government, sets you a target. How does the mechanism work that determines whether you do or don't get the money?
So as a nonprofit on the ground, I get a grant. I get a grant just like, I would from any other donor. The only difference is that this grant, instead of saying you will distribute X number of books or you will do, it's not tied to an activity. You're not distributing a pen or a pencil, but it's actually tied to the result, saying we will, work across. For this particular bond, we were getting paid on 2 outcomes. One was finding and bringing an out-of-school girl back into school, a girl who had possibly never been enrolled in school or had dropped out of school. And the second was on the improvement of learning outcomes for children. And this was measured against a treatment and control. So how well did my, children in my school do against what would have been a regular government school? So it was really kind of tied to that. I got a grant up front because I have no working capital. And then I delivered my program. And UBS Optimus Foundation that gave me the grant actually took the financial risk. I was simply taking and then SIF, the outcome payer, paid them back once I delivered on performance and the targets. And those targets were set based on the, a door-to-door survey that we had done on the ground that was checked by an evaluator. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. No, it absolutely does. Because there's a risk, you'll understand, Safeena, that things blur between targeted financial support, social impact bonds that have a measurement and then pay out, and the broader ESG impact investment for purpose. And I'm just trying to understand that whole mix. And I just wondered whether or not you think that the experience of being on the receiving end of impact funding changed your behavior on the ground.
It definitely did. It changed our behavior in huge ways. So just to tell you, it was a 3-year transaction. We work in very, very difficult areas, very rural and remote areas. And, we, at the end of the 3-year period, we had, and it was structured as a gold standard RCT, a randomized control evaluation. And our third-party evaluator found that at the end of 3 years, we were able to bring back 92% of all out-of-school girls. And in terms of learning outcomes, our children actually gained an additional year of schooling for the average student. So the gains were huge, but the way they happened was that the capital was upfront and it was flexible. So my teams, we could just decentralize a lot of stuff down to the teams. If they felt that the problem was more acute in a particular area, they were free to hire more people there. They were free to move resources. They were free to course correct. They were free to figure out what they needed to do. They didn't have a donor saying, well, I gave you money and you said you would do 4 village meetings, and so I just want to see my 4 village meetings. The money was just so much more enabling in that way. And it also came with support in terms of a performance management system and a lot of investment that we needed to make. Data, we didn't understand data as well as, you know, we needed to in order to be able to solve those problems. So I think a lot of that piece really came to us, and for our teams to become much more data savvy and be able to take decisions based on data.
Safeena, thank you. Just Jonathan Lass in the chat just asked, do you operate only in India?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Well, people are suggesting that maybe it's a model for doing things elsewhere. Amel, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but I just thought it'd be interesting to tee you up by bringing in Julia Greenland. Julia made this point in the chat that says, in their experience, outcome payment is the key limitation on scaling impact bonds. I imagine that means, actually, Julia, you can explain it. Are you there?
Yes, I am. And sorry, I'm calling from Kenya, so that's why I've had my my video off.
Okay.
It's quite late here as well. I work for CIV, who were the outcome payer on the Educate Girls Impact Bond, but are now going into a new impact bond, which is very exciting. In Kenya, it's the first development impact bond for adolescent reproductive health that we know of in the world. And DFID are acting as the outcome payer. And what we've found so far is that there's a great number of foundations who have launched program-related investment funds, and UBS Optimus are, of course, putting together quite a large fund of a payment fund for investors. But we found a key limitation has been the availability of outcome payers. Of course, with SIBs, the governments were an obvious outcome payer, but we tend to scan, when we scan the environment of big health purchasers or big services purchasers, there aren't very many who are both willing to approach a relatively complicated project like an impact bond, but who also have kind of deep enough pockets to make the mechanism worthwhile. So I'm curious who's working on that.
So, okay, Julia, thank you. Well, firstly, it's really interesting to hear what you're doing. Amazing to hear what you're doing in Kenya, and interesting to think about that point about scale. Amel, can I bring you in on that and just sort of pick up on the conversation we started with, that sort of Ronnie teed up too, which is how do you make sure these aren't sort of discrete experimental projects, but actually operate at a scale that have result in meaningful change?
Yeah, that kept me and my team awake for the last 2.5 years. I think it's what Safeena is doing is amazing. The question for us is, it's still, despite the size that she has, which is actually quite big for a nonprofit, we're still far away from what we need to achieve. Because today, I mean, alone the OECD countries spend $10 trillion in education and health, and they're not achieving the results they want to achieve. And to give just numbers worldwide, you know, taking the whole world population by 2030, and that's before COVID, half of the world's children were gonna be failing to learn. These are 800 million children. And so we need to find solution for the 800 million and not like in hundreds or thousands at a time, you know? So that's kind of one of our biggest driver. The second piece, which, you know, kind of drive us is to say, okay, there is already a lot of money spent. Where is this money going? You know, like if you take a plane from London to New York and only every second time you land in New York, you know, and, you know, otherwise somewhere else, you'll be kind of looking at what this company is doing, you know? That's what's happening in education. And so the question is for us, how can we use the existing resources more effectively, you know, and mainly government resources, but also some of the philanthropic resources and aid money. And also then how can we also bring new form of finance that is aligned to outcomes? So that our challenge is the mass and the results. And that's what we been creating, which is an outcomes fund, which I think Julia has been saying, which is the missing link basically. So this is the pool of funding. Our vision is to have a $1 billion in this case, and I hope in the future there will be many more outcomes funds that basically pool funding from government, from philanthropy, from companies, CSR, and then commission for outcomes. Says, I'm gonna pay for every girl that moves from primary to secondary and achieves this outcome. I'm gonna pay for every child, maybe in a London, areas or UK poorer areas, that achieves this, for example, skill training and is employed. So in a way, we don't pay for input. And I've been in government myself. I was minister in a government, and I've seen projects where you spend $70 million on textbooks, and everyone says they're done, successful input. And then you go 2 years later and you find these textbooks in the cupboards of the headmasters because no one has ever used them. And then you think, oh my God, what if we paid $70 million for children who can read a paragraph for meaning, would have not that changed the way things happen? And so that's kind of what we're capitalizing. And maybe to say the land, when we thought at the beginning, when we started this journey, is we thought we're building a fund. But what we actually found out, we're building a new form of partnership. Mm-hmm. And I'm writing an article right now that's called PPP is dead, long live PPP. So in a way, the public-private partnership is dead, I believe, because it comes from this government outsourcing, very kind of private bring finance thing in infrastructure, to a new coined PPP, which is partnership for public purpose. Because I think in this partnership, there are much more. There are governments, there are private sector, there are civil society, there is the media, there are like citizen, and in this partnership is actually not what for a certain public purpose. We want government to deliver better to their citizens. We want to hold them accountable. Yeah. And this partnership we're creating is a way to do that at scale.
So Amel, this is a question for you, Amel, and for Ronnie too. I suppose, let's say it's hard not to be persuaded by the idea that we could channel some of the enormous sums of money that exist in these markets to try and deliver public policy outcomes, for example, in education. But and putting aside ESG investment, but focusing specifically on impact investment, I think one of the frustrations has been that the marketplace hasn't grown. And I wonder whether part of that is because the providers of those social impacts are not there, right? So Peterborough is a good example. It's actually quite hard to find people who can train young offenders so that they don't offend again and can find jobs in the economy. I think of the issues we're facing today. If we're facing mass unemployment, are there the providers who are going to be able to do the retraining so that you can create effective social impact bonds? If you think that obesity is a problem, is there the private sector provision that can offset what's going to be spent by the public purse? And I just wanted, Amel, and I'll come to you, Ronnie, too.
I'll disagree with you.
You disagree? Good, far away.
I disagree with you completely, because we are living this actually today. Okay. So I think, one, because I've seen also on the chat that people say, so what's holding people, from doing this outcomes funding? And I think the main thing is that because, governments, I'll just take governments as the payer for outcomes here, often don't want, it's sad to say, but don't want to do things for the first time. And don't want to do things differently, and sometimes don't want to do things where they can be held accountable. Sometimes they don't want to do things where they pay only in 3 years, which is crazy, because with COVID, there would be even more cash stripped, and to tell them you won't pay today, but in 5 years, it means they have to change their budget cycle, and it's like doing things. So in a way, actually government, they should be actually queuing here in front of my house, and actually saying, I want to do this because I can pay only for results once they are achieved. Taxpayer money, amazing, and have actually the private sector, in terms of investor, take the risk. So, private profits is not dumping all externalities on societies and asking government to collect them, but actually taking the risk. And there are service providers. I give you a very tough example. We are working in Sierra Leone right now. Okay, this is news from last week. Sierra Leone is a super fragile country coming out of civil war, had a huge Ebola crisis. And we set, a partnership there with the government to say we're gonna pay for outcomes once children are learning. So it's like you can't probably choose a tougher environment to work with. An amazing president, and even more amazing. Now I'm gonna create him problem. Education Minister David there, and we're working together. And then we did an expression of interest, and people told us, oh my God, you'll never find investor and service provider who are going to be deliver on these. Last week, the expression of interest came in, I think with 17 or 18 investors, providers, / bringing pre-financing of almost $30 million, where actually we probably only need 10. So we have 3 times oversubscribed, and we have the service providers who are willing to do the work in Sierra Leone. So the thing is, and I've learned this from Ronnie, who can reconfirm this, is when you build it, they come. And I think it was the same with the tech industry. If you waited, like for Google and Apple and Facebook to be there to create, venture capital, then it would have happened. So it's the other way. We create a market for outcomes, like in, sorry to use this language, but we say there is the money to pay for these outcomes, and you create basically the entrepreneurs, the Safeenas of this world, who are gonna say, yes, I can solve this, and even maybe create organization and social enterprises who are gonna sell this.
Amel, thank you. Ronnie, what do you make of that? Are there the social entrepreneurs there to make the most of this market?
So the answer is that the supply of money creates its own demand, James, as Amel was saying had been the case with venture capital. And if you look at the younger generation of entrepreneurs, whether they be starting businesses or whether they be in non-profits, they are much more numerous than they used to be. Mm-hmm. I'd like, though, to sort of bring into focus 2 different strands of impact investment. So the definition of impact investment is it's investment that aims to make measurable impact as well as a financial return. Within that definition are 2 big strands today. One is what Safeena and Amel have been talking about, which is pay for outcomes. If you pay for outcomes, if somebody is prepared to pay for outcomes, then you can attract investor money and all the discipline that goes and the skill that goes with that money. And you have a much bigger probability of achieving the outcomes effectively than if you just gave the money away. Mm-hmm. The second strand is every form of investment, including venture capital, including property investment, including investment in bonds, including investment in quoted companies, where you measure the impact. Today, that market of impact investment, where the impact is measured, is about $750 billion. The ESG market is $30 trillion. And the aim now is to bring impact measurement to that 30 trillion of ESG money, because if the investors had transparency about the impact that companies were delivering, they would make much better choices about who to invest in. Today, everyone claims to be delivering positive impact. Every company reports on its impact in glowing terms. And I think the watershed between the risk-return paradigm that we have lived with for 250 years and the new risk-return impact paradigm is going to be impact-weighted financial accounts. What does that mean? It's financial accounts for companies which reflect the impact that companies deliver through their products, through their employment, and through their operations on people and planet. And later this year, an initiative I'm involved with at Harvard Business School will publish the accounts of 2,500 companies weighted for their environmental impact. And next year, we will add to that product and employment impact. Now, if I can just bring this to life, James, let's take what's been happening in the States with these terrible murders and the terrible rioting that has followed them. There's very little doubt in most people's mind that inequality and lack of diversity in employment is one of the root causes of the frustration that the Black Lives Matter movement fields. Now, if you had impact-weighted accounts, you would take a company like Intel, which has a wage bill of $6.7 billion from memory, and you'd say superficially, wow, that's fantastic contribution to society, all these people being paid for their jobs. But you would deduct from that the cost of lack of diversity. So you would look at what are the demographics around each of Intel's facilities, and you would look at what the representation in the workforce was relative to these demographics. And you take the number of missing people at every echelon of the company's organization and apply the salaries for that echelon. And you would come to a negative impact for lack of diversity of $4 billion. And that $4 billion would get knocked off the profit of Intel. This will give, if you do that for environmental impact as well, this will give investors a sense of what companies actually deliver in terms of profit to the world. Okay. And it will affect their valuation. Companies that are polluting very heavily will see investors shun them, just as they're seeing today talent shun them and consumers shun them.
And just explain two further things there, Ronnie, because I've never really heard that idea before. A, who decides? Who decides what gets measured? And then B, how do you translate that outcome in terms of diversity or emissions into a financial measure that weighs on the P&L, on the profit and loss account?
Okay. Well, James, you're a person with great historical perspective. So may I compare the current situation to 1929, after the Great Crash. Investors then sat up and said, my God, have we really been investing in companies without really understanding how much money they make? Because each one picks its own accounting policies, and there's no one to verify the accuracy of the numbers they provide. And so legislation was passed in 1933 in the United States to introduce standardized accounting principles for measuring the financial performance of companies, and auditors were also introduced. I think we are at the stage now with $30 trillion going to ESG investing, with $750 billion in impact investing, with young people refusing to buy the products of companies that pollute or create social problems or to work for them, where we are asking ourselves the question, are we really investing in companies by measuring their profit alone and ignoring all the harm they do, which governments then have to tax everyone in order to try to remedy that harm? And it's quite possible to define impact accounting principles. You will set them through an accounting board, just like financial accounting principles were set. And there's a massive public information now. And we have the computing and the data collection capability to be able to analyze, as I was doing for Intel, from outside, but it would be better if government mandated that companies had to publish this information, the impact performance of a company. And if you, as I was saying earlier, add the positive impact and deduct the negative impact, when you compare two companies, you'll be able to see exactly what financial and social and environmental contribution each one is making.
And if you are, I want to bring in, if I can, Becky O'Connor and Rachel Melson, because they've both made points, Ronnie, that touch on this about what's measurable and also how you actually move money away from those people who aren't delivering according to that public outcome. And it builds on your Intel point. So I'm just going to bring in Rebecca O'Connor. Becky, you there? I know you said you might. There you are. Hello. Can we hear you? Ooh, I think you're muted. Like, so, oh, there you are. You're out. No, you're off now. Hello there.
Hi. Yeah, so my first point is really on, should the focus be on, not a question, sorry, raising the bootstraps of those companies that already receive most of our money as retail investors, albeit indirectly. So pension funds that are invested in Shell and Rio Tinto and British American Tobacco, all of these things, you know, that we may not necessarily want our money invested in, but it is for better or worse. And perhaps there isn't the supply of impact investments available for us to simply shift all of that over. Given limited resource and energy from individuals, to what extent should we be thinking about regulations and improving standards within those companies to change the dial, rather than impact investing purely, given the weight of money that is in the global economy and the options available for it to deliver long-term sustainable returns to the ultimate investors, who are you and me?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry,
Ronnie, go on. Yeah, Ronnie, go away. Go ahead.
I was going to say this is an extremely important point. There's $38 trillion in pension funds across the world. And I would venture that 99% of the contributors to these pension funds have absolutely no idea what their money is invested in. Mm-hmm. They have no idea that it is going to pollute the atmosphere and to sustain companies that are using child labor and so on and so forth. If we begin to steer money to the companies that develop impact as well as profit, then we will find all companies going in this direction. There's no shortage of companies that deliver impact. There's only a shortage of companies that deliver more negative impact than they do positive. Mm-hmm. And if management becomes aware that the share price depends on delivering both profit and impact, then management's going to focus on that. But getting a movement, James, if I just make one last point, getting a movement going is what we're trying to do in the UK. Richard Curtis's Make My Money Matter movement is focused on precisely that, on everybody on this call writing to their pension fund manager and asking them to avoid making investment in certain categories of companies, like fossil fuel companies and other companies creating negative impact.
Well, Ronnie, thank you. We should definitely plug what Richard Curtis is doing, Make My Money Matter. I think it launches next Tuesday, and I know Rebecca O'Connor was involved in that too. In fact, we had a think-in with Richard on exactly this subject nearly a year ago about, you know, we were talking, I think at that time the acronym was Be Proud of Your Pension. How could you do that? Right. But can I just ask you one thing to be specific about, which is, can you explain for us the difference between the $750 billion and the 30 trillion? i.e., what's your definition of the difference between impact and ESG, environment, society, and governance?
So, as the global steering group for impact investment, which I chair, has been stressing, the difference does not lie in the intention to deliver impact. It lies in the necessity to measure it. Mm-hmm. The $750 billion is provided by investors who want to see measurement of impact alongside measurement of profit. Mm-hmm. The 30 trillion of ESG is provided by investors who are satisfied that the companies they're investing in have an intention not to pollute, mm-hmm. or to pollute less, for example. And so that's why it's so important, James, that we bring impact measurement to that 30 trillion, because it will then create massively greater impact, positive impact, than it does today.
Mm-hmm. So, well, Ronnie, thank you. I'm going to just ask, if I might, Adam Jackson to come in a moment, but I saw a comment from Rachel Melson, who was also flagging something. Rachel, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi. I did make a comment. I made a comment. I work with an organisation called Tobacco Free Portfolios, and we are also connected to Richard Curtis and Make My Money Matter. It's an excellent initiative. The way that we work is with the asset managers, banks and pension funds to persuade them to move their money out of tobacco. And in order to do that, to provide them with a framework that works with the structure that they currently work with, which is geared around their ESG structure, the way that they have to look at their investments, their fiduciary duties, and so on, and enable them to then make a decision on future financial risk alongside other issues to move their money out of tobacco. And I think the point that I was making is I think that impact investment is incredibly important, but as a percentage of total investment currently, it's very small. But it's within our gift to enable that shift of that money to become greater by moving money out of investments that are not delivering financial returns or any form of social benefit, and to free that money up to put it back into impact bonds, etc., areas that we see greater social impact being made. And to the measurable point, I think that so far we've seen a lot of ESG data and a lot of focus on governance and environment, but actually a complete lack in general of any measurement of social impact. And it's only the recent pandemic that has really proved that there is such a critical link between, you know, health and economic well-being, that we've started to weigh up the impact of products that we invest in and the way that we develop our investment opportunities over time, and the way that we want to look at those to actually take account of the social impact. And one of the areas that I confess that we've been looking at is how to develop a mortality index. And I recognise that a lot of people are going to say, actually, that sounds really hideous, but it's actually really important, because when you've got one product like tobacco, which kills 8 million people a year, more than any other product on the market, 8 million people a year, and that's a product that we're blithely ignoring that social impact.
And Rachel, just explain, a mortality index would measure the correlation between companies and the numbers of people they kill. What would it measure?
So, I mean, the initial difficulty would be companies and the people they kill, but it's actually very achievable to look at sectors. You could, or sectors or broad product ranges. So you could look at sugar, opioid, tobacco, guns, landmines and things like that, rather than down to which exact tobacco company, which company that produces products that have sugar in them, but actually to enable investors to get a broader general steer as to what they're investing in and why, and how to start measuring the relative impact, and it's about relative impact of those products from their investments.
Well, Rachel, I mean, I must ask you at some point, we'll figure out a way to connect, because my colleague, a fellow partner at Tortoise called Alexandra Musavizadeh, who's actually been the driving force behind indexes for us, was the person who made us first try and measure the gap between what companies do and what companies say. So we've created something called this Responsibility 100 Index. And the best bit about it actually is the gap between the walk and the talk, as Alexandra puts it. But we haven't thought of anything quite as punchy as the Mortality Index. So we must definitely put our heads together on that. It'd be really interesting to do. I'm going to just bring in Adam Jackson, because the reason, Adam, I was keen to do that was just to pick up on the point that Ronnie made about measurement and what we can actually measure, and how a kind of new world of accountants or audit might do, you know, impact auditing.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like accountants have been looking at this for ages. You know, I spent 6 years at an accountancy firm, and throughout that period there was work going on. There's always a risk that I think people want things to be absolutely perfect before they start using it. And, you know, accountants are by their nature perfectionists. So a bit of me thinks that there's enough work that's been going on that people just need to start using it. I think there is some attempts to adopt standards. I think it's Aviva have been doing quite a lot of work, and there have been various groups. I mentioned Future Fit business, which has sort of taken the SDGs and tried to turn it into a measurable framework that quite a few businesses are using. So it feels like there are models out there. People shouldn't try, you know, you shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I suppose there's a slight sort of worry that people are going to invest in the Betamax rather than the VHS of measurement. But, you know, actually we just need to get on and try some of these. Maybe we need a couple running at the same time, and then we can work out what's going. I do wonder whether, I think government has a role to play in pushing the requirement for those accounting standards to be adopted.
But, Ronnie, can I just follow up on that point that Adam's making? There's a bit of me that has that same instinct, which is like, okay, let's just get on with it. And I wonder whether or not actually the onus is on people who've got the money, you know, the BlackRocks, you know. Larry Fink talks about purpose. He could say, well, here's the way that we're going to invest our money. We're going to invest our money against those businesses that deliver on these impact audits. And if they don't, we won't. Do you think that's just wishful thinking on a grandiose scale?
No, that is beginning to happen. You see it where climate is concerned. For instance, James, today, activists like Chris Hom and others who are basically requiring management to set goals for reducing their emissions and so on and so forth. But I agree with Andrew. If governments now, as they did in 1933, come out and say, 2 years from now, I don't know that in 33 they took a 2-year time frame, I think it took a bit longer, but 2 years from now, we expect companies to publish alongside their financial accounts, impact-weighted financial accounts. There is today already a framework for publishing it. And you will find the accounting firms beginning to implement it. You'll create an impact accounting standards board, GAPE, relative to GAP, if you like.
Yeah.
And so I think if we can push governments now to mandate it, it'll happen a lot faster. I think it's going to happen anyway, but it'll happen a lot faster. And if you think about it, coming out of this crisis, governments are going to be debt laden. They're going to have a higher level of unemployment than they had before it. The most vulnerable are going to be hit even harder, and they're not going to have the budgets to help them. So if you don't bring investment capital and entrepreneurship and big companies to bring solutions to these social issues through employment, through their products, through their operations, we have no chance of doing that. And I want to make a more general point here, James. There's a rebellion against democracy and against capitalism. The reason is that democracy distributed political rights, and capitalism distributes social and economic outcomes. When people feel that the distribution of social and economic outcomes, the distribution of opportunity is unjust, and that the political system does not respond to their needs and does not redress this wrong, then you get the sort of rebellion that we have seen, that caused the referendum decision in good part, the Gilets jaunes in France, the riots in Chile and Lebanon, and also underlined the frustrations behind Black Lives Matter. So we want governments to understand that they have to mandate this out of necessity, not out of choice.
Ronnie, thank you. I'm just going to bring in Connie Park, who I can see has put her hand up. I think, Connie, if you're...
It's not me, Jane. I'm so sorry, it's Tess.
Oh, hello, Tess. How are you, Connie Park? Tess, hello.
It's amazing. I've got 30 years on Zoom tonight. Now, I was just going to make a couple of points. One, you know, historically, you'd like to think that revolution usually comes when you're coming out the U-bend, you know, when things are absolutely at their worst, people don't revolt. But as you come out, the revolution happens. And I really hope that's true to a certain extent. What I'm worried about is, as we go into a sustained period of low inflation rates, a sustained period of perhaps depressed growth, what pressure that puts on people in terms of returns and how much of a gamble they're prepared to take on an impact investment as opposed to traditional investment. But the other thing I just wanted to point out was some of the kind of encouraging signs that I've picked up on in the last couple of weeks. So for instance, I don't know if anybody tracked the management team at SSE have now set out their strategy against 4 of the big SDG goals, including their own remuneration. And as you know, James, I bang on about this all the time, which is there's this disconnect between the aims and ambitions of companies with their non-financial KPIs versus the financial KPIs. And I still think we're in a position, no matter what intention and what goodwill and what appetite exists, where the market still punishes organisations for failing to deliver on total shareholder return or EBITDA, or whatever it may be, even if they're knocking it out the park on their non-financial KPIs. And I still can't quite work out how, you know, maybe it will be the impact-based account system that becomes mandatory. I don't know, but how we close that gap between the walk and the talk.
Okay, Tess, thank you very much. In the last few minutes, I just want to come back to Safeena and Amel, which is, Safeena, thank you for staying up quite so late, but I would really love to know, having had the experience of development impact funding, what you think it could address beyond the education of girls, the way you think we should imagine the sort of next frontier of that kind of impact investment.
I think there are lots of pieces that impact investing can address. I think we have so many problems in the world today. I think there is a fear at some point in the nonprofit world that money and impact investment, if it happens, and grants will move to things that can be measured, and perhaps they might get divorced from social justice. So I think that there is some sort of fear that will it cannibalize money for social justice issues, which are perhaps not so easily measurable. But for me, at least from a girls' education perspective, I mean, we're seeing that with COVID, we're expecting, and this happened after Ebola as well, that out-of-school girls may triple. After Ebola, they went up from 8% to 21%. So, and my budgets have shrunk. They've gone down by 25%, you know, the day, like, you know, we hit 1st of April, the money was gone because governments are crunched, corporates are crunched. So I think, going back to what Ronnie's vision really is, I think we do need new money, and we need to address these concerns, but how else are we going to solve the problems? Because I have tripled the problem and have like half the money. So I think how we find sources of new capital and how we find ways to actually solve very, very complex issues on the ground with this.
Okay. Well,
I don't think we have a choice, is what I'm saying.
But that's really encouraging. Amel, send us off with a sense of what we can do. Send us off with a sense of how you'd like us to think about impact investment in this COVID world.
Sorry, you cut, but
yes.
You told me that I should send with a sense of, you know, I think that the opportunity to kind of to move the needle here is so much bigger than we think today. I mean, just to give an example, today in talks with the European Commission and the European Union to say, like, how can we use this outcome funding? One example, like inclusion of Roma, you know, population. It's a problem that all over Europe. They've been thrown money at it, but actually nothing has changed, neither in housing, nor education, nor their health. Nothing has changed over the last decades. It's rather got worse. I'd love to take that problem, tell them, okay, give me that money you're throwing at it right now, you know, and let us define the outcomes you want to achieve. Mm-hmm. And that's, you need bold leadership in government. And at the end, it is really about bold leadership to say, okay, and then I'll get the Safeenas of the world, you know, and to tell them, look, if you achieve the results, I'm going to pay you that. And I guarantee you, give me 5 to 7 years, and I guarantee you outcomes. Because, you know, when I was cabinet minister in a government, I thought that's the toughest job in the world. But then I had the chance to be 2 years leading an NGO or a nonprofit, a think and do tank. And I think that's the toughest job in the world, because we have a lot of amazing people with so much talent, of entrepreneurs, or, you know, social entrepreneurs. But the way we fund them is actually undermines the impact we want to achieve in society. We're binding their hands, we give them money to fill every coffee cup, and then we tell them, help governments and help the private sector solve these big issues, but, you know, you can't grow. I keep you poor and I keep you cash strapped. And so this is, I think, what we need: bold leadership. And I think in government, we need experts in government. You know, we need smart people in government. So maybe the highest form of volunteering is to run for office, you know? I think that's, and get us out of this with bold leadership.
Okay, Amel, thank you. And Ronnie, the last word to you. What would you like to see people do to usher along a world in which we're not just measuring profit, but we are measuring impact?
So I think each of us has a role to play, James, in this impact revolution. As a consumer, as an employee of a company, as a leader of a company, as an entrepreneur, as a pension saver, as an investor, as a government official. Let's make our choices in a way that is consistent with creating impact as well as profit. And if you believe in what the three of us have been saying today, let's give prominence to these ideas. All of the royalties from my book, which is available for pre-order on Amazon now, will go to impact to charities. So let us spread the word and let us persuade our leaders that they have to do this out of necessity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Ronnie, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, Amel, and thank you, Safeena, too. Thank you, everyone, for making the time to be on this call. You know, often these think-ins drive you to ideas or rethinking the world. The thing that's really sort of invigorating about this one is it takes an idea that we've been thinking about for some time, which is how do we see a capitalism that cares about more than its just financial returns, and forced us to think, I think, really about the small print, about how we move beyond, you know, big picture ideas like ESG and purpose to measurable impacts. And you know, for us, I think journalistically, impact-weighted financial accounts, it doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but actually it's the best possible way of imagining how business is going to have a real and different impact on our world. And I go back, I suppose, to the point where I started. When I began as a financial reporter, we were taught to sit and not read too much into the annual account, certainly not all the blah, blah, blah at the front of the book. The real juice, the meat was going to be found in the financial accounts at the back, and particularly in the footnotes. And so I imagine a world in which we see impact-weighted financial accounts and a world of footnotes that really tell you what businesses are doing. So for our own small part at Tortoise, I hope that what we can do, working together with my colleague Alexandra Musavizadeh and Alexi Mostros, who've also worked on this Responsible Business Forum, is see how we can push for a world that these things are measured. And so thank you for sort of opening our eyes to what's possible. Incredibly empowering. Safeena, to hear you, Amel, to hear you, Ronnie, to hear you. But thank you everyone for joining. I hope that this is the beginning of a longer conversation in more detail. But for tonight, thanks so much for your time. We're going to wave you off with a smile and hope to see you again before too long. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.